Is Harris Feinsod. Harris reporting from his office in Evanston, Illinois. Harris is Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literary Studies at Northwestern University, author of The Poetry of the Americas From Good Neighbors to Countercultures, published in 2017, and co-translator with Rachel Galvin of Olivero Giondo's Decals, Complete Early Poems. He is director of the Open Door Archive on Northwestern's website, and his current projects include a cultural history of modernism from the standpoint of the seaways and a co-edited anthology of global anti-colonial thought. So welcome, Harris.
Thank you so much. Am I audible? Everything's okay? Great. Please know how disappointed I am not to be in your physical presence today, though I'm certainly honored to be with you virtually, and thanks to Jahan and Matt for making it possible and rolling with the punches. There is a, let me do a little screen share real quick. Okay. There is a URL there, tiny.cc/commons, if you weren't able to get the handout, but it's just the poems that I'll be talking about in their full text, since I'll be referencing them rather quickly. Now, the act of speaking in Charlottesville while quarantined here in Illinois obliges me to give due consideration to the displacement side of our conference theme, yet for reasons I hope will become clear, I'll invite a slight shift of emphasis from place and displacement to something like possession and dispossession. And in lieu of place, I'll invite you to consider the literary matter of the commonplace and its historical corollary, namely the commons. Indeed, today I'll seek to outline the problem of the commons as it manifests in modern poetry of the Hemispheric Americas. And I mean the commons, in orthodox terms, as a feature of agrarian life. And I mean the poetry of the Hemispheric Americas as a comparative formation defined by historical correspondences and identities common to the literatures of this double continent, both in patterns of transnational circulation as well as unlinked patterns of affinity and disunion. My thinking about the poetry of the Americas has developed a dialogue with so many of you, with Rachel and Sonia and Daniel, and with Jahan's pace-setting accounts of transnational poetics. So given that we are among friends, let me just admit that these remarks come not from some well-defined new project, but from a rather unruly folder on my desktop titled simply Poetry of the Americas Part 2. And that's in homage to the 1993 Charlie Sheen vehicle Hot Shots Part 2, a satirical sequel about which I can say something serious if the moment should demand it. My emphasis today on commonplaces draws on the Martinican poet critic Edouard Glissant, who once spoke in passing of, quote, amassing commonplaces as a true approach to my subject, the problem of worldwide relation. And I followed Glissant in regarding commonplacing as a crucial practice for any comparative poetics of the Americas. As verbal artifacts, commonplaces subtend the very structure of literary topicality. To amass them is to participate in an established critical method of ordering and assembling topics, and commonplacing therefore constitutes a significant approach to investigating literature's co-implication with its conditions of existence. For example, in a recent article, World Poetry, Commonplaces of an Idea, which Jahan referenced, I argued that the malign term world poetry might be clarified by commonplacing its philological history, the poetic folkways and habits of use through which it has been expressed. That is, by reanimating world poetry's verbal parameters as a locus communis itself. So today I turn to a few poetic commonplaces on the question of the commons. And this is a kind of meta-commonplace, the locus communis of communal land tenure. And our itinerary will traverse the Mexican ejido system invoked by poets from Carlos Gutierrez Cruz, Salvador Novo, and Rodrigo Toscano to the identifications with state socialism in the early 1970s poetry and song of Cecilia Vicuña in Chile and Daniel Villete in Uruguay. And we'll continue to erode the distinction between lyric and song. Amassing instances here rather than proposing a theory, I hope to arrive at some contradictions that any theory must confront, such as poetry's role in historical materialist processes of mediation and determination. But first, just one more word about about my approach to the comparative poetry of the Americas. So one influential contribution to the tradition of hemispheric poetry and comparison was Richard Morse's 1986 article, Triangulating Two Cubists, William Carlos Williams and Oswald de Andrade. Morse, a historian with a literary inclination, compared two small avant-garde poems about farms. Williams is famous The Red Wheelbarrow, and de Andrade's equally brief lyric of peonage on a Brazilian fazenda, the farm. Roland Green, in his likewise influential article, Inter-American Obversals, described Morse's approach as, quote, Georgics read askance, a pithy way of expressing that Morse elicits nothing short of comparative agrarian history of the Americas, premised only on close readings of a few compressed lyrics. Now, I've occasionally challenged students to take seriously Morse's claim that avant-garde poetry might be read well in terms of agrarian history. And with notable exceptions, it has been a hard sell until they began to take an interest in Sonia Postmentier's brilliant argument about plots and provision grounds as pervasive figures for Afro-diasporic poetry. My own skepticism towards Morse's provocation has emerged from a different angle of vision as I've become interested in the vantage point of the comments. His focus on the New Jersey yeoman small holding imagined by Williams and on the exploitative post-plantation fazenda imagined by de Andrade elicits contrasting images of agrarian property regimes. It is no great leap from the wheelbarrow to the international combine harvester, or from the fazenda to the latifundio and the agribusiness. In short, do these old Cubist poems sanction an unfolding history of agricultural enemies? To comment, what would it mean to recover instead an agrarian poetry of the Americas at odds with this property regime and conducive to the thought of the commons? To begin, the various meanings of the commons in English do not translate isometrically into Spanish. Certainly the word común registers aspects of the mutual, the usual, the ordinary, the connotations you'd find in sentido común as common sense. But for the histories of land tenancy and collective ownership connected to the commons as a definite article, one needs the term ejido, which means the road of departure headed out of town. The social scientist Eiler N. Simpson wrote a doorstopper about Mexico's renewals of the ejido system during the revolutionary administrations of the 1930s, titling the book The Ejido, Mexico's Way Out, a double entendre for communal land tenancy as the departure road out of the village and as the path to economic growth. The ejido has a long history within Spain's empire in the Americas, where land tenure became governing preoccupations of the colonial project. Simpson, engaging with the contemporary anthropological literature concerned with the possibility of aboriginal communism, pointed out that pre-Columbian land tenancy systems within Nahuatl and Mayan village life made commenting distinctions between the so-called Altepetlali, lands divided by structures of kinship within villages, and Tlatmili, the fringe allotments from which we derive the word milpa. Large phases of colonial history revolved around conflict between communal land holdings and large private estates granted to colonists by royal favor. And yet the Crown recognized and institutionalized communal land forms, in some ways recategorizing the Tlatmili as the ejido. That is, Spain in fact solidified semi-communal land tenure through legal recognition of extant indigenous systems. Such ejidos resemble the understandings of the English commons that come to us via early modern and romantic poetry, where land is held apart from tenancy, building, or cultivation, and reserved instead for grazing, for waste disposal, threshing and winnowing, beekeeping, loafing. Some of that legal recognition waned in the Porfiriato, but for our purposes, what's important is that Mexico's project of revolutionary state socialism in 1917 enshrined the ejido as a constitutional feature of Mexican life. Article 27 promised that the state would hold and administer a vast ejido infrastructure. As late as 1991, half of all arable land in Mexico, nearly 1/3 of all land, remained organized by this constitutional act. Only on the brink of NAFTA did Carlos Salinas' sweeping privatization reforms dispossess many of the ejidos. Peter Linebaugh brings the moment to the fore in his 2002 book, The Magna Carta Manifesto, Liberties and Commons for All, a piece of the alter globalization left's profusions of commenting theory as they sought to think through the passage from NAFTA to the WTO protests. And I'll quote briefly, in a communique from the Wakandan jungle of Central America, Subcomandante Marcos, spokesman of the revolt of the indigenous peoples that burst upon the world in 1994, referred to the Magna Carta. The brilliant postmodern revolt of Mexico cited a tedious pre-modern source of England in 1215. That reference prompted this book, a mistaken translation, or rather an absence of translation altogether, because in Mexico, it so happens, everybody calls the Constitution the Magna Carta. How does poetry, now we come to the poetry, track or mediate the 20th century ejido? Consider Carlos Gutierrez Cruz, a poet associated with Mexican state socialism, whose verses were inscribed in some of the major muralist public works projects. For example, here is a verse at the foot of his friend Diego Rivera's panel, El Abrazo, in the Secretariat of Public Education, and I'll just read the English version for this time. Workers of the country and the city, dispossessed of freedom, strengthen the bond that unites them in pain and struggle, and an embrace of strength and love will flower from the fertile earth. After that embrace, they'll pay no tribute nor favor, and paddock and machine will bear all their fruit for you. Certainly the dynamics of the relation between the industrial proletariat and the rural campesino is one of the emerging debates of anti-colonial Marxism in these years, as in the rural pivot of Mao Zedong, contemporary to these verses. Here too is a version of enlightened socialist land management that stems from Kropotkin and flows toward the Green Revolution. Simpson's 1930 book on the ejido foregrounded Gutierrez Cruz's poem El Treinta Treinta, a simple corrido or ballad endeavoring to decriminalize the language of land petition and to structure a cry of revolutionary militancy in the face of dispossession. In tracing the poem's origins, however, we note that its first publication was in El Machete, a newspaper founded in 1924 as the official organ of the Mexican Communist Party. These are two photos by Tina Modotti that show both urban obreros and rural campesinos reading El Machete. In one you can make out the headline, Toda la tierra, no pedazos de tierra, all the land. These are part of Modotti's frequent recognition rumination on agricultural militancy in the revolution, such as her still lifes of cartridge belts, maize ears, and sickles, which you see here. Now in the late 1960s, Oscar Chavez, the Mexican exponent of Cuba's Nueva Trova movement, recorded Cruz's Treinta Treinta as a traditional corrido, and this is typical of corridos like Treinta Treinta in their peculiar identity as intermediate events, circulating across decades and diverse spheres of print and play, from El Machete to communal performances. In such spheres, they belong to what Michael Denning terms an anti-colonial, quote, noise uprising, focused on the problem, here, of land tenancy and revolutionary redistribution across greater Mexico, including the dispossessed Mexican areas of the United States. And here, I think it might be salient to recall that literary historian José Limon's Mexican Ballads, Chicano Poems of 1992 had forcefully argued that the Chicano poem of the movement era developed entirely under the sign of the corrido. Could we extrapolate for Chicanx, or perhaps even for Latinx poetry, to court that so much depends on the obstructed promise of the ejido? However, there are reasons to caution against the political romanticism for state culture propagandized by Carlos Gutierrez Cruz, or Modotti. One of the most striking critiques of such culture came from the poet Salvador Novo, a poet of the Contemporaneos group whose sexual politics were subject to homophobic attacks by state-aligned poets, and whose back in works such as Poemas Proletarios, Proletarian Poems of 1935. Let me read you a few stanzas from his poem, From the Remote Past, collected in Proletarian Poems, which pillory the revolutionary literature that was plied by Gutierrez Cruz. I'll just read this one stanza here. Literature of the revolution, revolutionary poetry, maybe 3 or 4 anecdotes about Villa and the flowering of the Mausers, the flourishes of the lasso, the Adelitas, the cartridge belts and maize ears, the sickle and the sun, proletarian painter brother, the corridos and campesino songs, and overalls, the blue of the sky, the strangled siren of the factory, and the new rhythm of hammers, of worker brothers, and the green patches of communal lands, or ejidos, from which the campesino brothers have excommunicated the scarecrow priests. The revolutionary propaganda pamphlets, the government at the service of the proletariat, the proletarian intellectuals at the service of the government, the radios at the service of the proletarian intellectuals, at the service of the government of the revolution, to repeat incessantly its postulates until they are etched in the minds of the proletarians, at least the proletarians who have radios and who listen to them. Time grows in silence, leaves of grass, dust from the graves that barely disturb the word. Now here and elsewhere, Novo punctures revolutionary conceits that claim to represent common and popular subjects, such as Gutierrez Cruz's poetry. You see here in its flowering of the Mausers, in Rivera's murals with their themes of embrace between the campesino and an industrial proletariat, or in Modotti's photographs with their partridge belts and maize ears, the sickle and the sun. For Novo, literacy, communications bandwidth, and commodity penetration set very hard limits on revolutionary representation. For Novo, large problems of mediation undermine the premises of a common state culture for the communal land. Novo's poem presciently described how the state had co-opted cadres of revolutionary intellectuals without radicalizing the program of land redistribution. Those who bore out a tendency of the Haciendero president Venustiano Carranza, for whom the ejido was a containment strategy. The most striking version of this argument came later from the radical filmmaker Raimundo Bleizer's eviscerations of the Frozen Revolution, which tracked land reform's failed promise 3 decades on. Now, although the 1960s hemispheric left decried Mexico's frozen revolution, it evinced a deep investment in the commons throughout Nueva Canción protest music, as well as poetry and conceptual art. And I'll just give 2 brief examples. Take, for example, the famous song A Desalambrar, literally to cut the wire or to break the enclosure, and which Barbara Dane has translated here as tear down the fences. This song is associated with Victor Jara, the Chilean folk singer tortured and murdered during the Pinochet coup, but it was written by the Uruguayan singer-songwriter Daniel Villete, a collaborator with the great poets Mario Benedetti and an interpreter of Roque Dalton. And I just wanted to show you the Paradigm Records liner notes here. Some of you may know Barbara Dane, the translator who was famous for her record, I Hate the Capitalist System. Dane was a revolutionary tourist in Cuba in 1966 and was inspired by the spirit of tricontinentalism, about which there's a wonderful book by your colleague Anne Garland Mahler, to publish records from the singers of the new protest movements. These records included detailed notes from policy groups like NACLA, the North American Congress on Latin America, further sort of refining the intermediate blend of lyric, social discourse, and performance that I mentioned above. Now, of course, the Chilean Socialist Project was the major wellspring of commoning poetry in the early 1970s, as in the projects of the Chilean multimedia artist and performance poet Cecilia Vicuña, initiated them as an exuberant young celebrant of Allende's administration. And I just thought I'd put on the screen here for a second her poem On Behalf of Seeds, in which she writes, I proposed a day of the seed to Salvador Allende, seed beds greening the rooftops and squares into forests and gardens, cities and fields into Edens. Allende laughed and said pensively, maybe by the year 2000. And what I love about works like On Behalf of Seeds is its mixture of celebration and restlessness toward the limits of a common culture afforded by state socialism, represented by Allende's gradualism. So Vicuña's poems do not serve the state. Instead, they propose a state that serves her untrammeled socio-ecological imagination. This poem was dated 1971, and a version appeared in 1973, but it began to circulate in the 1990s when Vicuña emerged as a kind of tutelary spirit for a new generation of avant Latinx poets associated with journals like Mandorla, the new writing from the Americas. And in that moment, Vicuña linked the conjuncture of the early 1970s to those altered globalization moments of the early aughts that had sort of intensified the theory of commoning. And she sort of links them in a generational cycle of what I think of as sort of phantasmatic promise rather than frozen disappointment. And that brings us to the demise of the ejido in the crucible of NAFTA, which I will index for you in closing with a brief reading of Rodrigo Toscano's poem Hidden Harvest from 2003. Toscano, born in San Diego, is a poet and union organizer who has been active in overlapping post-language, avant-Latino and anti-capitalist poetry scenes since the late 1990s. alongside his work as an organizer with the Labor Institute and in conjunction with the United Steelworkers. And his poem, Hidden Harvest, comes from his 2003 book, Platform, published on Lynn Haginian's Atilos Press, a book of poems that pointedly address the social commitments of late 1990s altered globalization activists. We find odes to Immokalee farm workers and Teamster strikes, meditations on the industrial base behind then labor leader Lula da Silva, and coy Brechtian satires of free trade summits. Tostano layers these fields of reference within a dramatic prism of intersecting speech idioms, a polyvocal strategy he simultaneously honed in the Collapsible Poetics Theater, another book from those years. And in that context comes Hidden Harvest, a post-NAFTA Ejido poem. Let me read the first of the poem's repetitive 13-line units. From a distance, almost festive, rippling in the morning breeze, soft conversations, great piles of scallions. A pungent sun illuminates the faces of young girls. She keeps grabbing them, straightening out their roots and tails. In a little gesture of self-consciousness, she pulls her sweater away from her face, knocks the dirt off, ties a rubber band around them. Ejido San Quintin, all are packed in ice and shipped to Great Britain. These lines suggest a vague scene of farm labor in an age of globalized food supply, and while each subsequent iteration of the poetic sequence repeats this basic structure of syntax and lineation, several factors transform. The scene of work changes to white-collar work, and then to service work, and then to poetry reading as work. So too, later parts of the sequence reverse the physical relationship between the she pronoun and the he pronoun protagonists of the poem, the relationship between self and class consciousness, the status of the agricultural commodities, and much else. The refrain, Ejido San Quintin, all are packed in ice and shipped to Great Britain, performs a kind of flattening effect, such that all the poem's variations on work, experience, relationality, and conscious ultimately run through a kind of supply chain rhythm of repetition with difference. In other words, this poem is working out the relationship between various fields of experience and participation under the processes of privatization. To again put this under the sign of William Springinall, this is a poem that asks, how do we witness and adjust now? And what I hope to outline in referring to these poems is something akin to Sonia Postman-Tier's argument for the provisioning ground, a range or inventory of possible effects exerted by the dream of communal land tenancy in the poetry of the Americas. These effects have distinct measures in the corrido and the critique of the proletarian poem, in the nueva canción, and in diverse generational cycles of the conceptual performance poem, such as from Vicuña to Toscano. And my intuition follows in the footsteps of historians such as Morse, for whom language art might well serve a serious contemplation of statist agronomy. I hope you will hear in this something like a simple reconfiguration of an old Marxist humanist question that has yet to run out of steam. How does verbal art mediate our ecological and historical materialist conditions of existence? Thank you.